Now that you have your Azure Architect roadmap, you are ready to turn that roadmap into a foundation that can scale without losing control. Your Azure landing zone is the point where cloud stops being a collection of separate projects and becomes an enterprise capability. You are not designing a one-time setup. You are designing the environment where dozens of teams will operate for years, and your choices will shape security posture, audit outcomes, cost predictability, and delivery speed long after the first workloads go live. With that mindset established, you need a clear definition that you can explain to leaders in one breath. An Azure landing zone is a structured and governed Azure environment that gives teams a safe, consistent, and repeatable way to deploy workloads. It combines organizational structure, governance guardrails, identity and access boundaries, networking principles, and operational requirements. When you explain it this way, leaders immediately see that a landing zone is not about technology features. It is about making cloud adoption manageable and accountable. With the definition clear, you now connect the landing zone to business outcomes that leaders and architects cannot ignore. Leaders care about risk, compliance, cost, continuity of critical services, and reputational impact. Architects care about scalability, consistency, and the ability to evolve without breaking everything. A landing zone protects both sets of priorities by preventing uncontrolled sprawl, creating enforceable standards, and removing repeated arguments about the basics. When you get it right, you create confidence that growth will not equal chaos. With the value understood, you can now anchor the landing zone around three foundations that make your design decisions easier. Structure is how you organize Azure so policies and access can be applied consistently. Guardrails are the minimum controls that prevent high-risk outcomes while still enabling delivery. Accountability is how you ensure every subscription, workload, and exception has an owner who is responsible for outcomes, not just activity. When these three foundations are in place, your organization stops relying on tribal knowledge and starts relying on designed governance. With foundations set, you start with management groups because they are your map of control. Management groups let you group subscriptions into a hierarchy that reflects organizational intent and risk boundaries. This allows you to apply governance and access control at the right level rather than negotiating rules subscription by subscription. When leaders ask how you will ensure consistency across the enterprise, management groups are a major part of your answer because they give you a scalable way to apply standards. With management groups defined, you now design the hierarchy based on how your organization actually operates. You usually separate production and non-production because the risk profile is fundamentally different. You may separate regulated workloads from general corporate workloads because regulatory obligations demand stronger controls. You may align lower layers to business domains so ownership and accountability are clear. Your goal is not to create a complex hierarchy. Your goal is to create a hierarchy where every level has a purpose that leaders can understand and defend. With the governance map in place, you move to subscriptions because subscriptions are where ownership becomes visible and enforceable. A subscription is not just a billing container. It is a boundary for access control, a boundary for policy scope, and often a boundary for risk isolation. When subscriptions are designed well, you can clearly answer who owns the workload, who pays for it, who supports it, and what compliance requirements apply. When subscriptions are designed poorly, cost allocation becomes political, permissions become messy, and incidents become harder to contain. With subscription purpose clear, you now choose a subscription model that balances control and manageability. If you create too few subscriptions, ownership blurs and blast radius increases. If you create too many subscriptions, governance overhead increases and teams become confused. A practical enterprise model separates production and non-production. Establishes shared platform subscriptions for foundational capabilities and creates workload subscriptions aligned to business domains or product teams. This gives leaders clearer financial accountability and gives security teams clearer control boundaries. With subscription patterns set, you now explain shared services because this is where platform thinking becomes real. Shared services subscriptions host capabilities that many teams rely on, such as centralized monitoring, centralized logging, security tooling, and core network services. Separating these into dedicated subscriptions protects the foundation from accidental changes by application teams and makes operational ownership clearer. When something goes wrong, you can quickly identify which team is accountable for the platform layer and which team is accountable for the workload layer. With structure established, you now define guardrails because structure without guardrails is just tidy organization without control. Guardrails are the minimum rules that keep your environment safe, auditable, and operable while still enabling teams to deliver. The best guardrails feel like a paved road because they remove uncertainty and reduce repeated decision making. The worst guardrails feel like a handbrake because they are unclear, inconsistent, or disconnected from delivery needs. Your leadership challenge is to design guardrails that reduce risk while increasing speed through standardization. With the guardrail concept clear, you now translate governance into leadership language. Governance guardrails create consistency through enforceable requirements such as ownership tagging, baseline security expectations, and restrictions on high-risk configurations. Leaders care because governance guardrails turn compliance into a scalable system rather than an endless cycle of audits and remediation projects. When guardrails are applied at management group scope, you reduce the risk of teams drifting into unsafe patterns and you reduce the operational cost of constantly policing every subscription. With governance guardrails in place, you now move to identity because identity is your most powerful control for reducing risk. You establish principles for least privilege access and controlled privilege access, ensuring that high impact roles are governed and auditable. You also create separation of duties so critical changes are not made without appropriate oversight. This is not about mistrust. It is about creating a system that remains secure even when staff rotate, contractors change, and teams grow under delivery pressure. With identity boundaries established, you now focus on network guardrails because many high-impact incidents start with unintended exposure. You define segmentation principles that limit blast radius, so one workload issue cannot easily spread across the environment. You define private access principles for sensitive services and controlled entry points for internet-facing services. You also define how connectivity is approved and managed, so teams do not create ad hoc network paths that become invisible long-term risk. Leaders value this because it reduces the likelihood of a single mistake becoming an enterprise-wide incident. With network guardrails clear, you now establish operational guardrails because you cannot protect or support what you cannot see. You define what must be logged, where it must be centralized, how long it must be retained, and who is responsible for responding to alerts. This creates predictable operations, faster incident response, and stronger audit readiness. When these guardrails are missing, investigations become slow and uncertain, and leadership confidence drops because you cannot prove what happened or how quickly you detected it. With visibility established, you now bring cost guardrails into the landing zone because cost is always a leadership concern. You define tagging standards for ownership, expectations for budget allocation, and principles for controlling spend growth. You also clarify how shared services costs are funded so there is no confusion or resentment later. Cost guardrails are not about slowing innovation. They are about ensuring cloud spending remains predictable, explainable, and aligned to business value. With guardrails in place, you now address reality. Exceptions will happen. Your job is to make exceptions safe, transparent, and time bound. You establish a process where exceptions have a justification, a risk owner, an approval path, and a review date. This prevents hidden loopholes from becoming permanent risk and keeps the governance model credible. Leaders appreciate this because it shows you are not building an unrealistic system that breaks under real-world delivery pressure. With exceptions handled, you now define the operating model because guardrails need owners. You clarify who owns the platform layer, who owns policy management, who owns cost controls, and who owns incident response responsibilities. You distinguish between platform teams managing shared services, application teams owning workload operations, and security teams setting security requirements and monitoring posture. This prevents the organizational failure pattern where everyone assumes someone else is responsible, especially during incidents and audits. With ownership clear, you now define what success looks like because leaders fund what they can measure. You measure landing zone effectiveness through reduced high-risk configurations, improved audit readiness, improved consistency of deployments, faster onboarding of new workloads, and more predictable cost outcomes. You also measure how often teams request exceptions and whether exception volume reduces over time as patterns mature. These measures show whether your landing zone is actually enabling delivery while strengthening governance. With success measures in mind, you now ground the idea with a simple comparison. In one organization, teams create subscriptions and deploy freely, relying on documentation and best intentions. Over time, costs become unpredictable, permissions become messy, monitoring becomes inconsistent, and audits become painful. In the second organization, a landing zone is established early with a clear management group hierarchy, subscription boundaries aligned to ownership, and guardrails applied consistently. Over time, teams deliver faster because they follow a paved road. Security operations has consistent visibility. Costs map cleanly to business owners, and leadership confidence increases because governance is demonstrable. The difference is not talent, the difference is architectural discipline. Let's now discuss the key takeaways from what you learned so far so you can carry these principles into every cloud decision you influence. Your Azure landing zone is an operating foundation, not a one-time technical project. And it is designed to make cloud adoption scalable and governable. Management groups provide the governance map that lets you apply consistent controls aligned to organizational risk boundaries. Subscriptions create enforceable boundaries for access, policy scope, operational ownership, and cost accountability. Guardrails protect security, compliance, operational readiness, and financial discipline, while enabling teams through standardized patterns. Exceptions must be transparent, time-bound risk decisions with accountable owners. And success must be measurable through consistency, reduced risk drift, improved audit readiness, and predictable cost outcomes. If you want your Azure environment to scale with control instead of chaos, subscribe so you can follow the rest of this playlist in order, because each lecture builds on this foundation. Like this video so it reaches more leaders and architects who need practical cloud governance. Comment with your biggest landing zone challenge such as management group design, subscription boundaries, or guardrails, and share this with your team so you can align on one set of standards and move faster together.